to have the opportunity to welcome you to this third and final day of our 2024 Festival of Learning and Teaching on the theme of sustainable success, teaching, learning and assessing well in STEM B. And I'm sure many of you have been here on for the first 2 days. So you'll remember Monday was teaching well. And when we're talking about doing well, we're talking about not just doing a good job, but also doing it in a sustainable and healthy way as well. And then yesterday, thinking about learning well, the broad view of learning. So certainly add 3 students in scope, but also wanting to think about lifelong learners. And that includes opportunities for those of us here who are educators ourselves, think actually, how can we keep on learning about the business of education and so on. Before I come today, an important reminder is to please vote for the poster prize winner. If you haven't yet done that, then please do that. I don't know if there is whether there's a QR code or something might cycle through on the slide behind me. Then grab that on your phone, open the page, and please do that. What's the deadline for doing that?
Good question.
Say by lunchtime. By lunchtime. Assume you need to do it by lunchtime, or you'll miss the boat there. Anyway, so we come to the third and final day, building on discussions over the last 2 days, and I think to tackle the most challenging theme of all, assessing well. I'm sure everybody here has seen the results of the National Student Survey, and I mean nationally, looking across all institutions. You'll know this is sort of universally an area where we struggle to meet the expectations of our students. The contrast is perhaps particularly stark here at Imperial, because on the one hand, we do very well overall in the National Student Survey for sort of Russell Group type universities, but we're also very low on assessment and feedback. So if you like, for us at Imperial, the gap is larger than it generally is. And I think that's something, therefore, that we have reflected on and we have begun taking action on. We've got a working group that Martin Kingsbury is chairing and so on, looking at this. There are some notable exceptions. I think it's important to say that as well. There are some fantastic examples of colleagues around this university, across the faculties and so on, who thought really hard about the way that they are assessing, the way that they're giving feedback to students, and have really transformed it and can show evidence that actually it is much more effective. So we know that we can do it if we put our minds to it. But we also know that the workload for both our staff and our students associated with assessment and feedback is too high. And so, again, that feeds in very nicely into the theme of this festival about assessing well. In other words, not just doing a good job, a better job, though we want to do that, but also thinking about how we do that in a sustainable way for everybody involved in that process. And I think that brings us neatly to our first keynote this morning. And I'm going to hand over to Monica to introduce the speaker. Thank you.
So the keynote for today is Dr. Ed Pitt. He's a reader in higher education research at the University of Kent. And if you are interested in the field of feedback and assessment, it's probably impossible not to come across a publication by Ed Pitt. He's very widely published. He received numerous grants. So it's a pleasure to have him here. So I'm not going to keep you away from Ed's speech any longer. So there you go, Ed.
Thanks very much, Monica. It's great to be here today to talk to you about an area that I've been researching for the last 20 years. And what I want to do is get us to consider how assessment and feedback can be classed as effective and how the role that the curriculum might play in the way that our students interact with all the different opportunities that we create for them. And as was just alluded to there, how that might potentially give us some wins on the NSS, but also looking at student learning and engagement and outcomes as well. So there's lots of different things that I'm going to tap into today. I'm happy to take questions at the end, of course, challenging as they will be. I'm sure that would be great to hear from you. I've tried to come up with lots of different examples from some various things that I've been involved in myself, but also drawing on literature that aligns closely to the disciplines that are represented here today, just to give you a flavour of some of the things that have been happening in the research field. So I wanted to put this slide up to start with, because I think there's lots and lots going on in higher education at the moment around assessment and feedback that can sometimes feel rather overwhelming. And I always say at the start of these talks, I'm very conscious of the workload issue and how much we do as academics for our students. And I'm going to pose some, I wouldn't say revolutionary, but some things that will perhaps go against the grain. And I apologise for any senior management here, but I think there's a good pause for thought at the moment about how we question the current dynamic that we have and the expectation on staff, and how we can maybe reimagine that situation for our learners. But we've also got the idea of satisfaction, and I'll mention that later, as difficulties for us to overcome the lever that pulls satisfaction, and the NSS has a huge impact on how universities do, how they're externally seen. It feeds into lots of different metrics. For example, the TEF is very, very important. The TEF about assessment and feedback from the NSS. So all of those sorts of things, how can we try and get those scores across the whole sector to improve? I'm going to talk about inclusivity as well a little bit later on, but I think there's a huge push at the moment to talk about inclusivity and variance in assessment, and I'll share some details about some interesting research that's been carried out on that. From my own institution, we have a lot of issues around differential attainment, and I've been to lots of universities over the last 12 months where attainment and differential classrooms and lots of students coming in with lots of different qualifications and different spectrums, and the challenge that that presents when we design assessment for everyone, when we have such a diverse student body. And then the last one was academic integrity, but in the last 12 months, I've had to add AI, because out of everything that we've got going on in the sector, that's probably the last thing that we needed was something else to think about. And that presents lots and lots of challenges for us, but probably lots and lots of opportunities as well. I'm not an AI expert, and I don't know if anyone actually is anymore, because it's changing every week. So I have got some slides that talk about AI, but it's something that's probably going to be discussed a lot further. I've seen the programme that you've got for the rest of the day, where there are people doing things around AI. So when we think about that, that is a bit of a tangled mess. And sometimes that can feel rather overwhelming when one's asked to excel in all of these different areas and create these world-leading curricula that attract students and make them satisfied, and hopefully produce graduates that are going to contribute well to society. So a lot of what I've been doing over the last few years has been informed by a huge systematic review that I did for Advanced HE. It was one of these things that, on reflection, was probably a little bit naive of me to think that this will be a quick win. And we got paid the princely sum of £5,000 to do this review. 50,000 words they wanted, and I got the colleague wrote this bells and whistles grant proposal, and we got it. And then I thought, how am I going to deliver this in 12 weeks? So I spent a lot of time, probably worked for about 10 pence an hour by the end of that period. But I was amazed at how much had been written between the years 2016 to 2021. 5-year period. There were over 3,100 articles that came up across the world around assessment and feedback, peer-reviewed journal. And we obviously didn't read every single one of those. We went through a lot of filtering, etc. But we did still come out with about 470 articles. Now that was quite a challenge to read 470 articles, analyse them, pick out, and we were tasked with looking at these articles for 3 outcomes. Student learning, firstly and foremost. Student engagement, which, if any of you have ever read anything on student engagement, it's probably the most ill-defined term in higher education, because it can mean so many things to so many different people. And also student satisfaction. And we wanted to look at demonstrable outcomes that we could draw upon, mainly so that we could help practitioners, but also so that we could get our sense around what was happening with the research, what was emerging, what was coming out. I think the thing I'm most proud of is that we were able to get articles that represented every inhabitable continent of the world. Now, one of the issues that we do have in this field that I've been part of for a long time is it's quite Western-centric. It's very much research that comes from Australia, Central Europe, and a little bit of North America. Now, that's problematic. So what we've tried to do is come up with some articles that tap into some of the things that are going on in other parts of the world. And it's interesting that we also started to veer into medical education, where there were very similar research fields in medical education and higher education, with lots of different similarities and findings. And some of the research that we've carried on doing has joined up those two fields to try and see where there are synergies, particularly when both of those courses are taught at the same university often. So I wanted to share with you some of the things that are coming out. There's loads of recommendations. Now, I have got a link at the end if you're struggling to get off at night and you want something instead of counting sheep, you can read the full article. It is searchable. We have chunked it up into different things. But what we're trying to do is shine a light on that and show what research is doing, but also thinking about how that might impact on the practice that we are engaging with. I'm conscious sometimes it can be, I'm only talking to people in my field about that. So how do we enhance assessment and feedback practice? So one of our recommendations was to look at authentic assessment. Now, how many of you have heard the term authentic assessment? How many of you have been encouraged to do authentic assessment? Right. Now, authentic assessment is one of these terms that is often used and often interpreted as, well, it's got to mimic real world situations because that will get students employed. That is only part of the story. And actually, authentic assessment, if you look at the founding tenets, has lots deep rooted in the founding foundations, if you like, of a university and why probably some of us got into university life, because it probably wasn't for the huge paychecks. It was around improving individuals that will contribute meaningfully to society. So there's a huge strand in authentic assessment about how that type of assessment can improve students' confidence, life skills, lifelong learning, rather than just employability. But I'm acutely aware that employability is obviously a big factor, and we are judged by that. And it is something that students will look for. But one of the issues with authentic assessment is that people often feel that they have to change everything that they do. And the things that they do that work in their discipline or are signature things that happen in a particular discipline have to be thrown out, and we have to do all of these radical new things. So things that we might see on the left here that we're very used to, things like essays, things like presentations, things like exams and sports or an invigilated space. We're told to diversify our assessment. A recent study by some colleagues at the University of Leeds, I think, is a brilliant example of where this has become a bit of a runaway train. They got their students to experience a diverse range of assessments. Academics were asked to do lots of new, different, exciting assessments that they'd never done before. Stressor number one, academics trying things new across an entire programme, every one of them, that's incredibly stressful for academics. It's also hugely risky. And by its very nature, most of us are quite risk averse because if we try too many things at once, it might have a negative effect on satisfaction and all those sorts of things. So they did that, but they also interviewed the students and said, well, what do you think about all of these experiences? The students found it incredibly psychologically damaging. The stress, the anxiety was hugely increased. So as well-intentioned as this was to improve the assessment, diverse range, they felt that they'd gone too far, and actually it increased stress for students. So the student experience had gone down. And I think this is a good example of when we look at things like authentic assessment and diversifying assessment, is thinking where are the particular moments in a curriculum where that would work really well and improve the experience, but we keep some of the things that we know are working. Some of this comes from a place of experience. Tales from the front line. My own university in the last 8 months have revalidated every single course, and every single module has had to be rewritten into a new curriculum structure, a new credit structure, a new teaching structure, all within 8 months. We got 1,700 modules in 2 weeks ago that we have to look at. All the learning outcomes to the right, all the assessment, all that. Horrendous. That was a way of us, in a strange way, of looking at our entire curriculum. looking at what was working. And one of the things that we worked with teams was, well, where does this work for your discipline? How would that make the student experience improve rather than sort of throwing out all of the good stuff you did? So what I'm talking about is a balance. But quite rightly, when we talk about authentic assessment, we're talking about how can our students know what they know? How do they know the skills, the attributes, the developments that they've gone through? So the ways that they think, the ways they practice, the ways that they've improved as an individual as a result of their experience. How can they advocate for that when they go to things like job interviews? And we've been doing some work with our history department at my university. And we got the careers in employability in, lots of embedding employability into the curriculum. When we talked to our students who got them to do CVs, what do you think was the first highlight that our students put on their CV? Any ideas? What would you do? What would you say? Your degree. You'd read that, wouldn't you? Number one thing, about 80% of the students' applications of CVs, GCSE in history. Not one thing articulating the skills, the ways they think, the ways they practice as a result of their history degree. And that was, for me, the thing that made me think, well, we need to do something about how they know what they've gone through in the last 3 years and how they can articulate that to a future employer. How can they sell themselves? Because we can do all we want in the curriculum, but if they don't know all those things, that's a problem, because it isn't going to get us the benefit that we want, and it's not going to help them. So this is one of the ways that authentic assessment is being suggested, is how we do model some of those things that might work in the discipline post-graduation. Now, we know that not every student leaves university and goes on to do exactly this they've studied, but a lot of students do, and a lot of students will start that way. So how can they articulate that? And authentic assessment, as I mentioned, has got huge positives. There are some references at the bottom. Unfortunately, you can't see those, but these slides will be available. Some of the things that is purported to do is the idea of a deep approach to learning. So students are really invested. It's a becoming part of the discipline. There's a really famous researcher called Roy Sadler in Australia, and he always talks about helping our students become part of the guild, become part of the discipline, become part of the academic community. So authentic assessment, modelling those sorts of things that we might do in our everyday careers. And the one in the middle is a lot based on my colleagues' work around interest and how students' motivation and interest in their subject can be increased by the idea of authentic assessment, something they get excited about. We're also thinking about meaningful and a sense of audience. Increasingly, we're getting our students to think about different audiences that they might communicate with. We see lots of different mediums that probably in our own careers we started to dabble in. How many of you have written a blog, for example, in the last 3 years? You? It's challenging, right? It's a different audience. It's a different style of writing. We're all very familiar with writing journal articles in our fields. When you have to move outside of that, it's a different audience. But sometimes that's about how we might connect with the public, for example. So how can we get our students to experience different audiences that they might write to? And authentic assessment, typically, lots of examples. Some of the ones that we've had in our business school, for example, where they can work with industry partners, how they can pitch, how they can do sort of moot courts, all of these sorts of things in law, those sorts of ideas around authenticity. And improving individuals. And I do feel that sometimes the narrative at the moment in HE and the bashing that we're getting in the media does forget the idea about why students might come to improve themselves and learn. It's not just about the outcome. So authentic assessment is a positive thing. But I wanted to give us some examples from the literature that give an indication of some of those typical things that we might already do. So I chose typical tests. Many of you will probably do tests. They may have slightly morphed over the last 4 years because of COVID, but typically they're about correct responses from students. Whereas in an authentic sense, you can slightly make that assessment change so that students are asked to justify why their reasons for the answer that they gave, or why that product might be better over another product, for example, or in performance, how that performance has evolved. And sometimes students can say to us, well, the typical test, how does that replicate what goes on in the real world? There's lots of discussion around exams at the moment, and how many exams students might do post-graduation, for example. So there's less constraints in terms of the real world examples where you get your students to do something that might represent what they do in the field post-graduation. So there's context, there's layers that relate to applied sense of examples that students might engage with. Or you might get students to isolate particular skills or facts or competencies. Now, that's not saying that those are not what we have to do. And this is my point that I made earlier around where's the balance. But it could be that you think, well, actually, for that particular skill, I don't want to just test that skill. I want to do this in more of a sort of range of skills. I want lots of different skills to be tested in an assessment. I want them to experience those and maybe work which is the best one for them, which one works in that particular situation. So it's slightly changing the dynamic of that assessment to make it slightly more authentic. And it could be that you've got one shot in a particular assessment, and this you might have on the right here more iterative or recurring tasks or sequence tasks that build on each other, just to start pushing the students. But I think when it comes to this, I'll re-emphasise the point, there might be just one or two options in a curriculum in the course of a year that would help our students to do that rather than every single assessment, as I mentioned earlier. And this is the thing that I think is probably something that, from my experience, and certainly what reports from the literature, every single curriculum innovation, every single change in assessment requires scaffolding. It requires the work on the academic to get that student to the point where they're able to do that. So it has to be joined up. It has to be designed in. What we found in our last 8 months was the stress of coming up with an assessment and playing that out in the academic's mind about how that might work is really difficult when you're not going to necessarily be teaching that for maybe 2 years. And some of us, hands up, who's gone into something thinking, I'm not exactly sure how this is going to work out. Yeah, and that's difficult, isn't it? To rationalise that in your mind, you think, you know, is this going to blow up in my face? Now, I don't know what the culture is it's Imperial, but certainly in the last 8 months at Kent, our culture has changed to say, it's okay to take risks. The only way we're going to improve and innovate is by having that safe space, creating that environment where you can do something that might not necessarily work, but the longer term goal might mean that we have a better, I hate saying the word product, but that's been a lot of the dialogue over the last 8 months. That is the curriculum that works. So it's finding that safe space, but the scaffolding for our students, and we have found obviously scaffolding with staff as well. So how did I make all of this come to life and give examples? So I'm going to do a little bit of a plug here. We started to think about authentic assessment, and we were worried that it was a little bit inaccessible and that everyone was going to focus on employability. So we came up with something called high impact practices. And we've developed a resource which we've called Superchargers. It's freely available on Advanced HE website. There's loads of resources on there. You can download it, you can use it, or you can get one of Advanced HE to come and do something with you in your teams. Absolutely fine. The premise behind it is these 8 different areas have extracted sections from our literature review that show things that work. But all these 8 things communicate to students things like high expectations, what we are expecting of our students, because we know that students don't necessarily always have the most calibrated understanding of what they're going to be doing in higher education. They've had an experience before, mostly at school, and I think yesterday or Monday, Monica was talking about international students and the sort of things that they bring along with them. I described some of our students as having 13 years of baggage. And sometimes we have to get them to unlearn some of the things that they've done at school or their previous experience. And this is the kind of high expectation. How are we setting that? How is it our curriculum communicate to our students what we're expecting them to do and the level that we're asking to prescribe? So we've got some examples in there. There is a big section on real world application and feedback. We're going to talk about feedback in a moment. But we've also talked a lot about things like meaningful interactions and how do we get students, for example, to work with other people that they might not necessarily have always gone to work with or had interactions with, or interactions with other academics, other people around their community in higher education. And then that links also with working with others. How many of you tried group work? Keep your hand up if you love group work. Keep your hand up if your students love group work. Yeah, that's my sense. Now, students sometimes say, oh, we hate group work, hate group work. But group work and working with others is probably one of the major things that students will go off and do in the world of work. Every one of us in this room has worked with people that we love working with, but also people that we don't love working with, right? But we have to create the environment where our students experience that. Isn't that the antithesis of authenticity? Creating maybe an uncomfortable situation where you have to work with others and you have to have that little back and forth and that rub where it doesn't necessarily go well, because that is authentic. But it's hard to communicate to students that they're going to have an uncomfortable time with a particular assessment because of all the things. But that is authentic. So we've got lots about working with others. Big section on sustaining student effort. 3-year degree undergrad is a long slog, especially when you've got other draws on your time. So how can we get students to sustain effort through assessment, and that they don't do it the night before, for example? So thinking about that. And then the other two here, and this is increasingly quite apparent, not least because we've done lots of work with undergraduates around public display of competence, being able to stand up in front of people and speak. That's going to be one of the major things that humans will continue to do in a post-AI world. Being able to communicate, being able to speak in front of audiences. So there's a big section on how we get students to display their competence through various different forms. That's going to be a real skill that students are going to have in undergraduate employability outcome. And the final one is reflection. How many of you tried to put reflection into your curriculum? How many of you have found that easy for students to do? Yeah, it's really tough. And that's one of the things as well that not least that we as academics have little time to do reflection. It's really important for students to reflect upon their experiences and look at how they've achieved X, Y, Z, how they've changed, how they've modified so that they're able to improve. And that does link into feedback. We've been doing some work about students using feedback diaries and reflecting on how they've changed over a period of time, how they've hit certain competencies, getting students to think more about that. So it's a plug, but it's also a sort of abridged version of authentic assessment, trying to extrapolate some of the things that we can do. And in the resources, there's literature to support the sort of things that have worked and not worked in different universities around the world. So I want to turn to feedback and focus on feedback. How many of you are engaged in writing or doing some feedback at the moment? And we're probably just about to approach peak feedback season, right? Yeah. How many of you are looking forward to all of that marking that you're going to have to do? You are? Yeah? Okay, but no one else. You are the only person. It's a big part, right? It's a big part of our jobs. And it's really hard to put our finger on how much time that takes, right? You probably will have a workload allocation and this and that. It's a big part of our job. So I want to talk about that. But before I do that, I want to talk about the ways that feedback has been defined in different terms over the last years. So quite often feedback, probably up until about 2015, was something that we as academics delivered to students. Okay? We were responsible, we had to construct and we had to give. And all of the research for about 40 years is littered with issues around students not looking at it, not picking it up. How many of you remember the days where you used to have all of the work in your office and it'd sit in a box, right? And then students wouldn't come and get it. And it's not as consciously aware now, because most of it's probably marked online, unless you physically go into the online database or the BLE and say, who's looked at that? Do you have that? Do you turn it in or something like that? Yeah. Yeah. Interestingly, I teach on the PG Cert, new academics that are on probation. How many percentage-wise, over a 5-year period, of academics look at their feedback for their PGCHE assessments? 60%? 10%. And I was thinking, what am I doing? What am I doing? What are my colleagues doing? How much time are we spending on feedback? Doesn't make a difference. But I'll return to that in a moment. In the last few years, some of the authors on there, but also a seminal paper in 2018 talked about feedback literacy and the idea that it is a shared responsibility. Learning has two parties. Has us, yes, as the academics, but also the student. And the student having a greater responsibility for the interactions that happen within feedback. It's always amazing to me that we as academics spend all of this time creating feedback, and yet students don't necessarily always do anything with it. And that's quite frustrating, I presume, for a lot of you, that it's expended workload that doesn't necessarily make a difference. So I want us to pause on that and think about that, because the analogy I look at is that sometimes Delivered feedback in the old method is a bit like some of the experiences I'm sure we all had during COVID, where we all went online and had to order everything to our house. How many of you have ordered something online and it's not what you were expecting? Yeah, quite often, right? Well, maybe feedback sometimes comes back to students and they weren't expecting that feedback. My PhD looked at students' expectations for feedback and grades. And in that research, students often had a sort of mindset around what grade they were expecting when they were doing a piece of work. And they had a good rough idea about the level that they were at in different types of assessment, but also in different subject areas within the sports science degree that I was teaching on. Those students often would then have a different reaction if the grade exceeded or was below what they were expecting. And quite often, in both of those situations, it was debilitating to the point where feedback didn't actually make a difference. And that was a sorry story, really, because the emotional dynamic of feedback is quite often underplayed. How do our students react? How do you react as an academic to feedback that you weren't expecting? Who submitted a journal article in the last 6 months and got reviewer tip? Yeah, right? It's hard, right? It's really hard. You get that feedback. It's not nice when you've spent a year writing something and all the iterations, and then someone says, rubbish, reject, or a desk reject, or whatever it might be. We have to cope with that, and it's really difficult. Or you submit a grant and you don't get any feedback. You just say, sorry, not today. That's really soul destroying. So our students have an emotional attachment to the work. Well, it's a big investment. But sometimes feedback can come with no instructions. I remember fondly, and we used to joke in the team room, I had a colleague that used to write K and U on all the essays that he marked. I said, what does K and U mean? He said, knowledge and understanding. So we were going to get him a stamp so he could just save time. But I said, what do students understand that to mean? Is it saying, yes, there's knowledge and understanding, or there isn't any knowledge and understanding? So sometimes our feedback has to give instruction to students about what they're going to do with it. Sometimes it's not in their language. We've got lots of language in our disciplines that is just you know, it's there for us. We're aware of it all the time. But our students sometimes are on different pages of our language. It doesn't fit them perfectly. Definitely had that during COVID with all the changes. But what I mean by that is it doesn't fit their context. And I've been doing some work on students that, or academics that are writing feedback for students, no matter what grade boundary they're at. And they're all sort of writing feedback that gets students to a first. But for a student that's at a third, getting to a first in the next assessment is going to be quite a jump. So how do we tailor our feedback so that it fits their particular concept, so that there is that way that they can scaffold and improve? And that's tricky for us to do. It's faulty or it doesn't work, it arrives, but they're out, and I mean emotionally. And that's harder for us to control. And we've been doing some work around how students understand their emotional regulation around failure and experiencing failure. And I don't know if you feel the same, but I do feel that in the moment, our society is very steeped in the idea that we have to have our highlight reel all the way out there, and that everyone is perfect and everyone never experiences failure. And I did toy with the idea. I asked ChatGPT to put in a picture of godlike figures in academia, because when I did my research with some third year students, they said to me, the thing with lecturers is they're godlike figures and they hold all the power. Now that's really, really difficult for someone to walk around with on your shoulders, right? That you're a godlike figure, that you're on this pedestal. And the images were quite funny, how it's all sort of all names things and stuff. But that's obviously the impression that it gives of academia and ivory towers. But I don't know about you, but I think maybe the relationship that we have with our students doesn't necessarily work if it is countenanced on massive power dynamics and us telling students and being. I'm not sure that works for us. So getting students to understand that we have failure and how we come back from that failure is probably something that's useful for students to understand. And the last one, and I think we live and die by this, is it comes after the date promised. But equally, if a colleague gets it back too early, that can also cause problems, because then the student says, well, they can do it, why can't you? So this whole expectation around timeliness of feedback. And obviously that's a question on the NSS that alludes to timeliness of feedback. And I'm going to move on to questioning that context in a moment. So what if we didn't deliver feedback so easily to our students? What if we weren't the only people that were providing feedback? What if they had to go and fetch it for themselves? They had to go off and find feedback for themselves. What if it was already around them? And one of the examples I'm going to give you, we did some work with a group of students, 200 students, that went off for a third year experience in business. So they did 2 years at university, third year went off into industry, and then they came back. When they came back, two things happened. First thing is that they were amazed at how different feedback happened in the workplace and how much responsibility was expected of them to go and find feedback with managers, peers. How also feedback was more of an iterative thing, where they would have an opportunity to act on feedback through tasks, through workshops, working in groups, whatever it might be. But they also said to us, why is university not like that? You tell us that it's authentic, and yet what you do is very different. So we had an issue there with satisfaction. So I wasn't the most popular person when I exposed this, but it made me think, well, if we say authentic assessment, how do we create authentic feedback? And is the idea that students have to go and find feedback, have to go and interpret it, but also interact and get feedback from what's around them, coursework, the textbooks, all of the things that we do on the VLE? How does that work in the dynamic of feedback and the influence on their learning? So I'm going to share some examples. So I'm going to return to this image. The challenge with feedback in getting students to understand feedback, develop their feedback literacy, is scaffolding. We can't have the instantaneous hit. There's lots and lots of examples in the literature review where people have tried something in a module in an isolated fashion. We did this in week 3, and then by week 6, the students liked it. The amount of research in this review that says students liked it. Is students liking something an indication of an improvement of learning? Is it an improvement of using feedback? And the one example I'll give of this is audio feedback. There isn't a single study that demonstrates greater uptake of audio feedback than written feedback and the change in students' work. All of that research is about students liking it, feeling more satisfied. Even the most crazy thing, they listen to a 3-minute video, audio clip, and say it's like having a conversation with my lecturer. But it's a 3-minute audio that they've just, honestly, it's crazy. So the modality changes the mindset, but it doesn't change the uptake, doesn't change the use. So how do we scaffold that into students' experiences? But how many of you sometimes feel like this? You don't feel exhausted after all the marking? Do any of you feel like this? The time that we do a lot of our feedback happens at the end of an assessment. When we ask students, there's a brilliant survey that was done in Norway that asked students in education about their expectations of feedback and when they want feedback. They want developmental feedback. They want something that they can improve their work. All of those students in that research say they want it to come when they can do something with it. And that speaks to the idea of being in training whilst they're constructing the work. So in a formative sense, so that it can have an effect on the years to come. And we talk about how we use feedback and how it can improve our work. And a good example of that is journal articles. So most of us will send our journal articles to colleagues or to peers that are at other universities and say, can you give me some feedback? Any of you do that? Yeah. And then they give you feedback and you can do something with it before you submit. Then you submit, you might get minor modifications or whatever, and you do those, and then you submit and you get it published. But a lot of our students, if there isn't the opportunity to be able to get that feedback prior to final submission, and then we spend all of our time writing feedback about what they could do better, that for me seems like a bit of a long way round. But yet we spend hours and hours and hours doing that in marking. Many of you have been marking your third year assessments. And how many of your third years come back to you and say, can I see the feedback that you wrote in my script? Anyone ever experienced that? Yeah, we have to do it because the process is there. So I want to talk about that in a bit moment, but I also want to talk about feedback culture, and I want to highlight 2 studies. Because I make the point around how can we weave feedback into the curriculum? How can we create an environment where feedback is seen as part of the process rather than something that happens at the end? And there are 2 studies here, one of my own, where I spent a lot of time working in performing arts. And the culture within performing arts was 2 things. The first one is that the public display of what you're doing, work in progress. So have any of you ever been to a comedy club before? they're not the most pleasant places, right? And if the comedian isn't very good, then the audience generally let the comedian know. Well, from an authentic assessment point of view, this one module that sticks in my mind was a comedy degree. And the first module, they created a comedy club. And the students had to come up with comedic acts, and they would replicate the way that the audience would normally respond. The key thing in the developmental sense was that students had multiple opportunities to get back on stage, refine their act, use the feedback, so that feedback became a public display. So students could see each student's act, they could provide feedback, but also they could see from week to week how students had incorporated feedback and improved. So the performance became a public artifact. That was the exemplar, if you like, of how students were using feedback. Hugely powerful. I really enjoyed that study. And then the second one there is from Norway in biology. And this was around structured essays. The students had to do 4 pieces of work. And iteratively, over the 12-week module, students would use their peers for feedback. Different peers. They would write feedback for each other. And the refinement process would also be interjected by the academic to calibrate. And over that period of 12 weeks, that essay would morph and improve so that students would have feedback from multiple sources, multiple peers, and it would be up to them to sift through what feedback was useful and what feedback was not useful. And that would bring me on to an interesting point. We talk a lot about enactment and uptake and feedback. But how many of you choose to ignore feedback sometimes and not do anything with it? Yeah, you do, right? But that is being feedback literate and understanding that feedback necessarily at that point in time maybe doesn't apply, but it maybe does later down the line. And I think that really came home to me is I was randomly in Victoria Station one Saturday with my family, and a student came up to me, and I recognised that face. They looked a bit older, and I hadn't seen them for 10 years. And they said to me, some of the things you said in my 3rd year, I've only realised in the last few months what you were getting at. That came home to me. Now, unfortunately, in our roles, we never see all of our students and where they go, right? Which is sometimes a bit frustrating. But sometimes you have an impact, but the ripple happens way further down the line. We can't capture that, but it's sometimes there. So feedback doesn't always have to be active. That isn't really talked about in the literature. Some of the things that we talked about. I think it's something to consider. But this, for me, is the essence of feedback. Feedback is everywhere for students. But unless it's got somewhere to land, it's like one of these planes. If you've ever been in a plane in a storm and you're surfing Gatwick or Heathrow and you can't land, feedback needs somewhere to land. So my point is, where can we create landing spaces in our curriculum for the feedback of all of our workload efforts that can have the maximum effect on our students? How do we think about our workload allocations, but also the way that our curriculum is designed so that feedback is designed into the process? Where can it land for our students? Because that is, I think, where students will be satisfied. Now, you've all seen the change in the NSS over the last couple of years with the questioning. So feedback now has a question that says, I can't remember exact words, but it's something around the lines that feedback has helped me to improve my work. Now, there's a subtle inference there that feedback uptake is more considered in that question. How does feedback improve the student's work? So where does it feature? That's only recently got that question to me. So I want to talk about a couple of things. Timing. What's the feedback turnaround time here? You got policies? How many? 10 working days. Yeah. Can anyone tell me why 10 working days is the peak turnaround time for our students? I asked this every year. No one knows. Most universities have between 10, 15, 20 days. Right? That's us being the puppet masters. That's saying to students, your feedback will come after 10 days, and it will be mostly aligned to a summative piece of work. And that's what we think we will be judged by on the NSS, because of timeliness, right? I get it. But most of our policies will drive practice. So the things that you do in your working life will be driven by policy. So what we've been doing at Kent is changing our policy. It's thinking about how does the policy drive behaviour in academics, but also by influencing the behaviour of students. So how does feedback feature in a policy? So turnaround times, whilst they're still there for NSS purposes, there's also a dedicated section around the purposes of formative assessment and the purposes of different types of feedback that students may experience, and how we're then tasked with communicating that to students so they appreciate all of the availability for it. Because timing is crucial. But if we only ever align to our feedback policies, and this is where I was worried that I'm going to have senior management of, but it's the idea is that policy is the root of all evil and the root of all good. How can your policy dictate a behaviour and a curriculum that works for you and the students? Because the timing issue, as I mentioned, if it's at the wrong time for you, it might be the wrong time for students. And this is where I think a really good example from Irish medical education, the references at the bottom, unfortunately you can't see it, they talk about a 5-minute feedback form. And this happens when students are on placements and rotations over the course of their medical degree. And they will have to actively seek out feedback opportunities in that medical experience. There will be lots of those, interactions with patients, interactions with consultants, nurses, wherever it might be, all of the things that they might do. They have to understand and take responsibility in the process. So there's a big setup, there's a big scaffolding process that happens so that students understand the premise of what this form is trying to get them to do. And then they're asked to do weekly self-reflections around the self-assessment about where they are in their learning. They use rubrics, for example. Areas for future development, what might they need to work on? Progress and overall learning goals. And it's a reciprocal cycle. So they're going back to return week on week to where they are. Now, there's a really good culture in medical education of reflection that's built into a lot of the assessments. But how can we carry over some of that, some of the things that we get our students to do? The key thing with this, though, is that whilst this was responsibility for students, the academic having some oversight and some intervention, some constant reminder. You know, you can't just tell students to do something for 12 weeks and then expect them to do it, right? There is going to have to be some intervention. And it was mediated. So some of them were more successful than others. But the weird thing is, the students, when they were asked, at that experience, they felt that they had personalised feedback. They were the ones that were generating the feedback. It wasn't the academic, it was them that was doing the work. But they felt that it was personalised feedback. That's a strange situation, that they were more satisfied because they'd done the work than they were when an academic was giving them constant feedback. And that says to me that maybe it's okay for our students to have more responsibility. There's more ownership, maybe there's more agency, and it has more relevance. The final couple of things I want to talk about is we've been doing some work on feedback talk. Feedback, as I mentioned, is happening all around. Lots of the interactions that we have with our students in teaching time, we could classify as feedback. So we had some transcripts from seminars with academics in various different subjects, and we did stimulated recall. And most of those academics at the beginning of that interview didn't feel like their teaching was anything to do with feedback. They said that's just teaching. By the end of it, they realised that actually a lot of the interactions they were having with students where they might ask a question, so you and I might have a dialogue, and you might come up with an answer to a question, and I might come back with another, and you were elaborating, and I said, well, your argument, you know, all that sort of stuff. But everyone else in the room can also see how your argument's constructed, how I'm giving you feedback on your argument, and then learning from that public display, that interaction, and how that feedback can then potentially feed into their own work. But how many of our students realise that feedback doesn't have to be written? That those dialogic interactions that they have with us, but also those dialogic interactions they have with their peers, in group work situations, in their seminars, whatever. All of that is part of the feedback situation that we create and design. But we probably don't get very much credit for that. So we've been trying to do some scales to get a greater understanding of students' conceptions of feedback talk, but also academics' conceptions. And really realising that a lot of what we do is very well planned and executed, and it doesn't just happen by chance. And the last thing I want to talk about is feedback opportunities. Where are the ongoing opportunities? Some of that doesn't have to be extra workload. Some of it, I think, is a bit of a marketing thing for us to get students to appreciate feedback more, to be able to understand those interactions, as I mentioned earlier. And the paper that I wrote with David Carlos talks a lot about that, how there are some of those more specific actionable feedback that we asked students to do weekly. We had some examples where academics would provide written feedback. We also had academics using students to give feedback week on week. So interactions that they have and being able to join the dots with those. And I think this is a really good example from engineering education, showing the distance that travelled across a 5-year period with students that were on an engineering programme, that probably at the top represented the more traditional format of delivery around didactic lectures and feedback after submission. And then in 2015, they moved towards more problem solving interactions, feedback weekly on those problem solving through peers, but also academics and GTAs, but also asking students to self-assess. And there's lots of different rubrics. I'm doing a huge project with the University in Hong Kong at the moment on self-assessment rubrics about process, getting students to think about their skill development, their competencies, how they can understand where they currently are, and using feedback to improve iteratively. And finally, in 2017, realising that the culture had changed. The dynamic in the classroom had changed. When it comes to the NSS, I normally get asked about the NSS every year around January the 10th to January the 20th. I get a head of school or a dean who say, can you come and speak to the school? And the first question he says, how can we do well on the NSS? And I say straight away, have you got a time machine? He said, look, I said, what do you mean? He said, because you need to be starting the NSS the day they arrive in their first year. That's how we control the narrative. That's how we change the culture. We control their expectation. So this is what they found here, that the responsibility had shifted. They were embedding that pedagogy, but it took time. The key thing was, and this was in Holland, the key thing was this, is that there was an embracement of the fact that it would take time. The short-term interventions don't tend to happen. I can't remember the exact study, but I remember there was one in there that this university in South Africa had a satisfaction survey thing the whole university had to do. And they did all bells and whistles satisfaction things for a number of years, and then asked the students at the end, and not one student could recognise what they'd done. Imagine that, doing all that effort and none of the students giving any credit. So it doesn't always land with our students. I'll mention briefly, there's some work that we're doing at the moment on exams and how exams can have a changing function. The reason for that mainly is because we're going to have more exams that are punctuated throughout the term. For our courses, we're going to 3 terms of 8-week teaching. So exams are going to feature a lot more in the course. And of course, because of that, students are going to be around and expecting feedback on their exams. But also, how do exams have a learning function? And this study, I think, is really a good indication around using the examination from a first year in the second year and getting students to self-evaluate when they finish their exam, going back to the script, thinking about what they've done, coming up with action plans about how they might do it differently, peers commenting on the quality of the action plan, some teacher feedback as well, and then the goal setting for what they might do in their further exams. So exams having a learning function, I think, is something that's probably going to see it evolving, and we're just finishing this research, but we're finding that most universities don't have exam feedback. Do you have exam feedback here? Do your students request exam feedback, or are they giving it? They're giving it. There's a lot of policy, I won't name any institutions, but some of them treat exam scripts like, you know, when you go to British Museum down the road and you have to wear white gloves, a certain right? They treat exams like that. And we have this weird sort of, it must be kept for audit purposes. All these strange things about exams being very different to coursework. But for students, when we ask them, they say, well, why is it treated different? This is our work. We want feedback on it. So there's lots of around the functionality of examinations for learning. And the final thing is on peer feedback. Have any of you tried peer feedback? Yeah. Does it work?
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's hard. It's challenging. And it does take time for students to understand what they need to do. So the study I mentioned, David Carlos, we found in the first few weeks, we had a lot of the sort of pleasantries, a lot of the, oh yeah, it was really good. Yeah, we loved it. When actually it wasn't really good. And then over a period of time, the students became, at times, quite brutal in terms of the feedback they gave, because they realised that it had an effect. And there's lots and lots of research. I think if you want to read Bart Huseman's work, it's fantastic on this, about the different ways you can anonymise feedback and all the issues around the point of expertise and all that sort of stuff, hugely. But what all of that research says is two things. Students need multiple opportunities to be able to do it. And it's great if it goes across many different instances in a program study, but also it's better to give than receive. And why? Because it's more cognitively engaging to have to come up with reasons why something is good or why it can be improved, rather than passively receiving the feedback. So the act of being able to become a connoisseur of quality in different examples. So I think that's the thing I'd leave you on peer feedback. And the final thing is ChatGPT. How many of you have used ChatGPT? How many of you think your students are using ChatGPT? Yeah, they definitely are. I remember the first few weeks of this at university said, what we need to do is ban it from the browsers, but they don't. That shows the scale. The horse is running around the field, right? But there are opportunities, there are difficulties. But there was a recent study, only came out in the last few weeks, that looked at 74 essays through ChatGPT generated feedback versus peer feedback. And what they found was that ChatGPT was quite descriptive. And if you've used it, you can sometimes see that it's surface level. Whereas peers identified problems, things that needed to be improved, things that were problematic. So the level of interrogation of the piece of work perhaps slightly different. But there's no significant correlation between the quality of the essays and the feedback from either source. So it could be a complementary role for both in the feedback process. But if we are to assume that AI is going to be in many different areas of our lives, then our roles are probably going to change, that we have to help our students to understand how to use AI. Unfortunately, we're only a few sentences ahead of our students in the textbook, as it were, and that's quite challenging for us to all become AI experts. And I don't think that's going to happen overnight. But I think there are possibly some real potential sources where students will be able to interact with AI to be able to provide feedback. And it might act as another source to calibrate their understanding or the quality of what they're producing, rather than what we hope they're not all doing, is just firing questions in and getting output. And what I would say on that, in my experience, is you can put stuff, even in the images on ChatGPT. If you've got the paid version, have a go at that and see what different levels of quality you get on the images, because it's not as good at the moment, but it will improve. But I think it'd be interesting to hear what other people are going to say this afternoon on AI, because I think that's obviously a really a noble thing at the moment. Lots of understanding, lots of counter analysis and data coming out on the benefits of AI. So it's very much an emerging field. But it's I wanted to address the elephant in the room. And with that, I think kind of near the time. So shameless plug for the review and the students trial. So it's all free. And if you can't log into Advanced Launching, I'm happy to email it to you. Has anyone got any questions?
Thank you for this very inspiring talk that really speaks to quite a lot of practice across the college. So first, let me just have questions. If anyone have a question.
Just like that. Thank you so much. Amazing talk. It's more of a comment really from, my own sort of practice with feedback. And I think it's very, very important to highlight, and I'm delighted, of course, that came up obviously during the talk, that creating opportunities for students to act upon feedback. And again, giving them feedback on how engaged they were with the original feedback is, has an exceptional impact on the students. And, I do that in my own practice in the intercalated BSc that I lead on. And the students see that as one of the best ways we can actually support them. So they see it as a form of support rather than, anything else. So I think creating more opportunities with the formatives, with the practice, you can always, drop a lecture and turn it into something else and create practically something that students, in my practice, I do it almost like the act you described. It's a group work, it's peer feedback, it's instant feedback, it's verbal feedback followed by written feedback. And, it's almost like individualized without naming each person in a group, but it's later on, sharing each group's feedback with the rest of the cohort. and it's unbelievable how students can, positively take that practice and see how that can impact their performance coming to the tasks or the summatives.
Right. And I think one of the NSS questions about the criteria, advance and students understanding the criteria. And mostly our interpretation is being more put the criteria on BLE or put it in the module guide, but students tell us they want to work with the criteria. So exactly as you described, the activities around what they might, do as a summative is understanding how that criteria might manifest themselves in different situations and how different students interpret that for different quality. Becoming a connoisseur of quality, as I mentioned, is something that's really important for students to then be able to reference that to what they're producing. And I think that's the holy grail of this, the whole point about feedback, is being able to then bring it back to yourself. That's always challenging.
Precisely. And I think I'll just add one thing. I think, again, with everything like, the AI literacy and feedback literacy, it's very important to educate our students about, how to reflect and how to act upon feedback. So in the curriculum, there has to be sessions where we actually just address things like that. And that's how the students can use that as a tool, because not everyone is hardwired, for reflection and for receiving and giving feedback.
Yeah, I think seeing the benefit of some negative feedback is good life skill. Certainly, if you go into academia, have that armory, because you've got to have a bit of skin at times, right?
Yeah.
And if you've never been exposed to that, it's difficult. There's some actually really good research coming out at the moment from Hong Kong around feedback dialogues with PhD students, and how, because a lot of PhD students will go into academia, and how you can create that dialogue, because sometimes the landing space is naturally there, right? It's different to an undergraduate for that purpose, but how you scaffold that and improve, and even to the point of Viva, feedback works in Viva situations, because obviously that's quite an important point. So all that is very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Following the earlier comment, do you think that the reason that the intake of feedbacks sometimes is very low is the timing, as you mentioned earlier as well? I think lots of the assessments that we have are assessments of learning that happens at the end of the modules, the activity. And when students don't see a way to improve that anymore because it's done, they don't care about that. What if we change the perspective and have assessments as learning or assessment for learning? But the problem is that those are also sometimes are not taken serious as well, because there is no mark for that. What if we have assessments as learning, but as a summative components? What do you think about that?
Yeah, so you sort of back continuous assessment.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a balance, because you've also got the issue of the workload and the students and the perception that they need to do the same amount of workload for a very low weighted piece of work as they would for a really high piece of work, and that might not be as sustainable. If you think about competing demands, I don't know what your course structure is, but in our one we had 4 15-credit modules, and we realised that students were having all their assessments at the same time, and they were doing, like you described there, there's all different weightings. So we've changed that so that there are assessment periods, but it's also dotted and there's less assessment. So we reduce the amount of hours we expect them to do and reduce word counts and things, which doesn't always make it easier, because sometimes we have to more concisely can be more challenging, but it's thinking about also the whole picture of the course and how are these things joining up. If you look at, there's some work on what they call it Tester, where they look at the whole course and they look at how the 3-year scaffold essentially and how they build, but all of it's premised on the whole success of that being all of the units connecting, so that all of the academics understand what everyone else is doing and they're picking things up. And that is challenging to do unless you have a real review on that and look at how these sort of things match up. And that's one of the ways you can potentially use summative feedback, subsequent iterations of a similar task, if you like, that you can build. But it's a conflict that you have to take. And I think there is success with continuous assessment, but I think it's It's where students understand the merits of the weighting and how that's going to affect, but also the formative tasks that aren't weighted, seeing the longer term benefit of engaging in the process so that you get the outcome. You can't just do the last bit. It's like training for a marathon. You can't just rock up to the front line of the start and expect by somebody to run 26 miles, but that's the majority, right? And if you haven't done the training, then your summative occasion is going to be difficult. But we don't always see that in students understanding that.
Sure.
So it's a balance.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the talk. That was great. I just have a question about formative peer assessment. You gave some examples where students gave each other feedback. I think in the structured essay, I think it was on 4 occasions, and the academic was having an oversight of that. So I was just wondering, what was the feelings of the students and staff generally about the workload? Did the workload change? Were they happy with that, or?
Yeah, I would describe the study being quite workload heavy on students. I caveat and say that that was different to a lot of their other experience. Because I remember talking to the author about that, and I raised that exact point. Said, you know, the parity of what your expectations are. But I think what they were trying to do was prove to the students in the first place the benefits of peer feedback, because sometimes they do need convincing. Because there is that rhetoric that well, we're doing your jobs for you, even though there is a big education gain for doing it. We know that. But I think, yes, you're right, there was a lot more workload, but I think the students then saw the benefit of that workload. So I suppose in another sense, you could physically see what was going on,
Yeah.
and sometimes we can't always see the workload expenditure of our students.
But can we generalize? And so, I mean, you've done a lot of research in this area. So generally, what is your feeling around the workload for staff and students?
I can give you some examples. One example, I haven't finished writing this up, but we did do a project with third year business students, but not in the field necessarily yet, but where they were asked to do 8 presentations over the course of a 30 credit module for 24 weeks. And each of those presentations were 2.5%. Now that is a really small weighting, but there were 2 things they did. The presentations were public, so in a way the educator was getting the students to teach the other students. They had to analyse different areas of a business and their different operations, and each week they would have to do these presentations. The about 1.5 grade boundaries increase for every student that was on the course from presentation 1 to presentation 8. The key thing was that all of the content that others were doing would then into the examination where they had to analyse another business, but use the information from the other presentations. So they had to turn up, they had to basically engage. And what we saw was at the end, when we asked students what did you experience, their first instance when we told them what they were going to do, this was going to be horrendous, the workload's go, just don't, we can't do this. They actually trust the process, it will be fine. At the end, the students said, the best thing they've done. They realised that their confidence levels to present, their competency to present in front of people had gone like this, as well as their grades, and they've improved. So yes, I suppose 2.5% is not great, is it, pedagogically, but it did serve a purpose to get to. So sometimes assessment can pull those in. You could say that it was over assessing, because they basically had 9 assessments for 30 credits, which is a lot. But it served a purpose. So it was only one instance in that degree program. It wasn't every module. If every module. So I said that's what I kind of feel back to the point I made earlier. Is where does that sort of situation that's going to have a huge educational experience potential and improvements fit into a course? It could just be one experience rather than everyone having to do it. So I think that would be unsustainable. Does that answer your?
Thanks for the presentation. Have you looked at the affective dimension of feedback? So specifically the extent to which students are able to dissociate feedback as professional practice versus an attack on their integrity or themselves?
Yeah. So in my PhD, yeah, huge. I always regret this term. And it's just not nice. So I'm going to say it. I'm going to cringe. We call it emotional backwash. I think that that overriding effect. And what we found is that the students that were perhaps at the higher parameters of grade achievement were better at being able to disassociate, whereas the students at the lower end would often attribute some of those comments to the fact that it was going to them, attacking them, and that it was them as an individual and not their work. And there's quite a lot. There's a great author, if you're into this, there's a guy in America called Carlson Fong. I think he writes really accessibly. It's just, it doesn't use too many fancy psychological words. You can really see as a practitioner how that might feature in your own interactions with students. I think it's a 2019 paper, it's really good. Just breaks that down into the sort of different things the students might be operating with emotions. But I think it's a huge, huge area that qualitatively we don't have enough data. I would say lots of quants, but not necessarily lived students' experiences. It would be good to do sort of more longer term. My own PhD student was a year long. There was some data in there about emotion, but we didn't necessarily align ourselves to that. So we didn't quite enough, but it's definitely a thing. But I think what I was alluding to earlier is another thing we can do is when I mentioned about you telling your students, for example, how you react to your feedback on whatever we call that intellectual streaking or intellectual candor for grant purposes. And in that, we found that actually by breaking down that barrier around how we deal with feedback helps our students to realise that it's okay to be upset. That actually learning isn't just like that, right? There's bumps in the road, and being uncomfortable is probably a necessary part of learning. And my previous career was in sports science, a lot of coaching, and that's kind of accepted fact in high level sports performance is that you're going to get adversity, and it's the degree to which you cope with that adversity and come back from that that often will define your success later on. So our students understanding that it's sometimes okay to be upset, what we do with that as a result, what are you going to do to change? I'm not sure. One last example from my PhD, I remember students saying that sometimes not doing very well gave them the kick up the backside they needed and actually made them realise that they were coasting or hadn't put enough effort in, and actually receiving that negative feedback, as they called it, and the emotional reaction to that made them change for the better. So it could provide stimulus.
That's a final question.
So, thank you so much for your presentation. I think that's great. In the last couple of slides, you mentioned about studies which compares the ChatGPT generated feedback and the peer feedback. So I wonder, and also colleagues talk about the workload. So I wonder whether the large language models such as GPT can be part of the feedback practice landscape. So yeah, I'm just interested to hear your views on that. Thank you.
There will be companies that I think that we can certainly train things like ChatGPT. I know a computer scientist in our computer department that took ChatGPT off, put its own sort of GPT over the top of it and trained it to mark a simple essay on my PG cert, and it was able to distinguish between a distinction, a pass, quite easily through just being trained 3 hours about the criteria. The next level is then being able to write personalised individual feedback, which that might be, but probably a lot of it would be the prompts that are put in, right? So again, a lot of students, the prompt engineering, the ones that are really good at that will get better at it. The ones that are not so good probably won't get as much as they would want, but it depends. But there will be students that will be doing that, and it could have a positive effect on their learning in terms of calibrating what they know. But I think it will need some level of training for what the particular context is. But I don't think there's an assessment that we can make completely, safe from AI. I'm not convinced about that. If you're interested in that particular field, there's a guy called Phil Dawson in Australia that I would definitely root out on social media because he's written a lot about that area.
I think we have to wrap it up now. Thank you so much, Ed, for